Welcome to Founding Chronicles. If you enjoy stories of America's hidden past, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a tale from history's shadows. Now, settle in as we journey back to the winter of 1877 to a Dakota schoolhouse where a storm descended, and what was found inside has haunted the prairie for generations. This is Snowbound Secrets, the Unsolved Dakota Schoolhouse Story of 1877. In the winter of 1877, the Dakota Territory was a land both full of promise and full of peril. Settlers had come west chasing fertile soil, wide horizons, and the dream of a life carved out by their own hands. But that same dream, especially in the vast prairies, was bound tightly to hardship. The winds were harsh, the winters were merciless, and when a storm swept down across the plains, there was no man nor woman who could stand against it. That year, the winter had come early, and it came hard. The sod houses of homesteaders rattled. In the endless wind, the dry grass plains already buried beneath snow that seemed deeper than memory. Yet life had to carry on, especially for the children. Even in such conditions, the settlers built small schoolhouses, little wooden sanctuaries of learning standing alone on the frozen prairie. One such schoolhouse stood a few miles outside of a scattered settlement near the Big Sioux River. It was a modest place, its walls plain pine, its roof tarred against the wind, its windows patched with cloth to keep the drafts out. Inside, benches, and a small stove stood ready for the dozen or so children who trudged through the snow each day. The teacher was a young woman named Margaret Hayes, only 19 years old. She had come from Minnesota the year before, hired to bring reading, writing, and arithmetic to the children of the settlers. Margaret was kind and firm, with a clear voice that carried well in the small room. Though she was young, the families trusted her, for she took her duty seriously, often walking through the cold herself to make sure children reached home safely. On the morning of January 9th, the sky had been clear. The children arrived bundled in wool, some with scarves their mothers had knitted, others wrapped in whatever scraps their families could manage. Margaret stoked the fire, chalked the lessons on the board, and the sound of reciting voices filled the air. By noon, the sun had dimmed. A haze crept across the sky. By early afternoon, the wind had picked up. The windows rattled. Margaret paused, glancing out at the prairie, and saw the horizon swallowed by white. She knew the signs. The blizzard had come down in those days. Storms struck without warning. There was no telegraph to spread word across every homestead, no weather, man's voice to predict the danger. One moment, the prairie seemed still. The next, a wall of snow and wind roared across it with a violence that could blind a man in minutes. The settlers called them White Death. Margaret faced a choice. She could dismiss class early and send the children home, hoping they would make it to their farms before the storm grew worse. Or she could keep them inside, trusting that their families might come for them. The wind was already howling. Some of the children lived miles away. The snow was coming fast. To send them out now was to send them into the jaws of the storm. Margaret decided they would stay. The schoolhouse was not meant for nights. It was a daytime shelter, not a home. But Margaret gathered the children, stoked the fire higher, and tried to keep them calm. The wind pressed against the windows. Snow began piling against the door, sealing them inside. The sound was unlike anything most of the children had ever heard, an endless shrieking, a furious pounding, as if the sky itself had turned into a beast clawing at the walls. The children huddled near the stove. Some whispered prayers. Margaret sang hymns with them, her voice steady, though her hands trembled as she fed the fire with every scrap of wood she could find old kindling, even a broken chair leg. The day faded into night, though it was impossible to tell the hour, for the windows had gone dark under the snow. They were sealed in, the prairie gone, the outside world erased. By the second night, the firewood was almost gone. The food the children had brought in their lunch pails was shared, but it was meager, half a biscuit here, a slice of apple there. Margaret gave her own portion away. The storm howled on. The little stove glowed faint, then dim. The air inside turned bitter. Breath fogged in the air. Fingers numbed. The children cried quietly, their voices thin against the roar of the storm outside. And yet, the strangest part of this story is not merely that the schoolhouse was trapped. It was what happened after. Days later, when the storm had passed, and men from the settlement dug their way to the little wooden building, they found the door nearly buried. They called out, their voices muffled in the drifts. There was no reply. Shovels cut through the snow. Axes cleared the frozen crust, and the door was pried open. Inside, the stove was cold. The air was heavy, still, bitter with the scent of smoke and frost. Every child was found seated at their desk, their small hands folded, heads bowed as if in prayer. Margaret sat at the front, her chalk still held in her hand, words half written on the board. None of them had tried to escape. None had moved from their places. And though the cold had surely claimed them, their faces were strangely peaceful, their eyes closed as if asleep. But there was one detail that baffled everyone. Though the storm had howled for 3 days, though the snow had piled higher than the windows, not a flake had drifted. Inside, the firewood was gone, the stove cold, but no one had moved to take apart the benches for fuel. The children had not huddled together for warmth. It was as though they had simply waited, silent, and accepted their fate. The settlers whispered that something else had happened in that schoolhouse. Some said they had heard voices on the wind in those days, carried across the prairie, children's voices, singing softly, though no one could tell from where. Others believed Margaret had told the children to sit still, to remain calm, and they had obeyed her until the end. But even the hardest of men could not explain the strange order of it, the eerie stillness, as if the schoolhouse had been frozen not just in ice, but in time itself. Word spread, carried from settlement to settlement. The Dakota Schoolhouse became a place people avoided, even after spring came and the prairie bloomed again. Some claimed that if you walked past on a winter night, you could still see lamplight in the window and hear the faint murmur of recitation, the ghostly lessons of children who never left. Others swore they had seen the faint outline of a young woman at the door, standing against the snow, her hand raised as if to shield her students from a storm that never ended. The story was told in whispers for years, and each retelling only deepened the mystery. For while the prairie was no stranger to tragedy, the manner of this one, the strange peace, the unanswered questions cast a shadow that never lifted. Families moved away. The schoolhouse, left to weather and rot, eventually collapsed. Yet the memory lingered, carried in old voices, until it became less a memory and more a legend. Even today, when the winds rise on the Dakota plains and snow sweeps down across the land in blinding waves, there are those who pause, listening. For some swear that the cries of the storm are not just wind at all, but the echoes of children's voices, bound forever to that schoolhouse of 1877, where a young teacher and her students sat snowbound, waiting for a dawn that never came. The news of the schoolhouse spread quickly across the Dakota Territory, carried by wagon drivers, post riders, and the steady trickle of letters moving eastward. But unlike so many stories of hardship, crop failures, frozen livestock, men lost, on the prairie, this one struck people differently. It was not only the tragedy of young lives cut short, but the strangeness of it, the unexplainable calm in which it was found. For the settlers, the prairie was a place of harsh truths. Death came by fever, by accident, by storms and hunger, and it was met with grit. But this was unlike anything they had ever known. Men who had lived through years of loss found themselves speaking of it in hushed tones, their rough voices uneasy. Women who had buried children before could not understand why Margaret Hayes and her pupils had simply stayed in their seats, waiting for the cold to take them, when there was wood to burn, when there were windows to break, when there was even the desperate chance of escape. The parents of the children never fully recovered. Most of them had been trapped in their own homes during the storm, unable to reach the schoolhouse even if they had tried. When they dug their way out after the blizzard cleared, the first thing they had done was head to the school, fearing the worst, but praying to God for a miracle. What they found instead became a wound that would never close. Among them was a farmer named Elias Crowley. His daughter Anna had been only 9 years old, a quiet girl with brown braids and a fondness for drawing pictures in the margins of her school books. Elias was a hard man, a veteran of the war, weathered by loss and toil. But when he carried his little girl's still form from that room, the strength seemed to leave his body. He did not speak for days. His wife said later that she would sometimes find him sitting in the barn at night, staring at the lantern light, whispering his daughter's name over and over until his voice cracked. Not another was the family of the Larson boys' 2 brothers, aged 11 and 13. Their mother, Inga, had begged them that morning not to go to school, for she felt in her bones that the weather would turn. But her husband insisted the boys keep to their lessons, and the family depended on the routine. When she saw their bodies return to her, she collapsed into the snow, wailing in the old tongue of her homeland, her voice carrying over the prairie. Until even the animals fell quiet, the families buried the children together, side by side, in a small plot near the church. Margaret Hayes was laid to rest among them. There were no grand coffins, only plain pine boxes hammered together by neighbors. The ground was hard as stone, and the men had to break through the frost with iron picks before they could lay the bodies to rest. It was said that the women sang hymns through tears, their voices thin and cracked against the bitter air. But for all the grief, what lingered most was confusion. At the burial, whispers ran among the crowd. Why had they stayed in their seats? Why had Margaret not broken apart the benches to keep the fire alive? Why had the children not gathered together, as instinct would have told them? It seemed as if some unseen force had passed through that schoolhouse, commanding silence, commanding stillness, holding them in place until the cold claimed them all. In the weeks that followed, men began to talk of visiting the site again. Some believed the storm had left clues buried in the drifts, tracks perhaps, or something in the walls of the schoolhouse that might explain what happened. Others said it was foolish, that nothing could be gained from stirring up sorrow. But curiosity gnawed at them, and so a small group returned. They found the place much as it had been left. The desks sat in their neat rows, as if waiting for the children to come back. The chalk still marked the board half a sentence, unfinished, Margaret's final lesson frozen in time. But there was something else, something that none of them had noticed in their grief. Near the back wall, faint lines had been scratched. Into the wood. They were small, shallow marks, as though made by little fingernails, or perhaps a dull blade. They did not form letters, not words, but shaped circles, spirals, patterns that repeated. The men stood staring, their breath fogging. The cold air, unease creeping through them. When they asked the parents about it, none could explain. Some said their children had spoken in the weeks before of strange dreams of being snowbound, of hearing a woman's voice calling to them from the wind. Others dismissed it as imagination. But the markings on the wall remained, and they were never forgotten. That spring, as the prairie thawed, some families packed their wagons and left the settlement altogether. They said they could not stay in a place where their children's laughter had been silenced. The land seemed cursed, they said, and no harvest was worth it. Those who stayed found themselves avoiding the schoolhouse road. When children walked past on errands, they hurried, eyes down, claiming they heard whispers inside, though the building was empty. The minister of the small church declared that the devil had tempted the children into despair, that Margaret had failed in her Christian duty to guide them, and that God had allowed this tragedy as a warning. But others, especially the mothers, rejected his words. They could not believe their children had been led astray. Instead, they spoke of something else, something nameless that had entered the school that night, something that held their little ones captive until morning never came. As the years passed, the tale grew darker. Travelers who stopped in the settlement were told the story, usually at night, by firelight, the teller's voice low and heavy with dread. Some said the children had not died of cold at all, but had fallen asleep in a strange, unbroken dream. Some said Margaret herself had been seen afterward, standing in the snow beside the ruins of the schoolhouse, her hair loose, her eyes black as coal. Others swore that if you stood at the place on a still night, you could hear the scratching of chalk on a board, as though the final lesson was still being written. And yet, through all the versions, one truth remained. No one could explain why. They had sat so still, so obedient, as the storm howled outside. No one could say why their faces looked peaceful, why their hands were folded neatly, why not one had risen to resist. It was as if some unseen command had settled over them all. By 1882, the schoolhouse itself had begun to fall into ruin. The roof sagged, the windows shattered, the door hung crooked. The settlers argued whether to tear it down, but none wished to touch it. Superstition held their hands back. They feared what might be stirred if the boards were broken apart, if the chalkboard was removed, if the marks on the wall were destroyed. And so the schoolhouse was left to the weather, a silent shell upon the prairie, visited only by wind and memory. But though the building crumbled, the story did not. It passed into legend, told to newcomers as a warning of the prairie's cruelty, whispered to children as a tale of obedience and fate. Yet in each telling, a chill seemed to follow, for it was not just a story of death in a blizzard. It was something deeper, something unsettled, something that spoke of powers unseen on the vast and lonely plains. And so, year after year, when the blizzards came down from the north and the winds screamed across the empty fields, people remembered. They remembered the children, seated quietly at their desks. They remembered the young teacher with her chalk frozen in mid-stroke. They remembered the silence, the stillness, and the mystery that no man could explain. Even now, some say that the prairie itself remembers. That when the snow comes thick and the wind shrieks against the walls of lonely houses, the voices rise again, the faint murmur of children's recitation, bound forever to a schoolhouse that should have been forgotten, but never was. By the turn of the century, the old schoolhouse was nothing more than a sagging ruin, its timbers gray with weather, its roof fallen in. Grass and wildflowers crept around its base in summer, while in winter it stood alone against the winds, a hollow shell filled with snow. Most of the settlers who had lived through the tragedy were gone by then, buried in the little churchyard, or scattered to other states, chasing easier land. Yet the story endured, passed down by the next generation as if the prairie itself demanded it never be forgotten. Children who had never seen the inside of the schoolhouse could tell the tale by heart. They would whisper it to each other at night, daring one another to walk to the ruins on cold evenings, to stand inside the rotting frame and listen. Some swore they had done it. They told of strange chills, of the feeling of eyes upon them, though the place was empty. One boy, years later, claimed he had heard the soft tapping of chalk on a board, though no board remained. Another insisted he saw a row of desks, neat. As soldiers, though when his father returned with him the next day, there was nothing there but snow and weeds. Old settlers frowned at these tales, but they did not laugh. They knew too well that the prairie was a place where strange things could linger. They had lived long enough to see men vanish in storms, their bodies found months later a mile from. Their homesteads frozen in poses that seemed more like sleep than death. They had seen lights flicker across the plains with no fire to explain them. They had heard the cries of wolves at nights when no wolf tracks were left in the snow. The prairie was wide, lonely, and old, and they knew better than to dismiss the unseen. By 1905, newspapers from farther east began to publish pieces about the Dakota Schoolhouse tragedy. Some told the story straight, as a warning about the ferocity of the blizzards and the need for better weather prediction. Others bent it into ghost tale, exaggerating details, painting Margaret Hayes as a spectral figure leading her children into silence. One article from Chicago described the scene as if the children had been enchanted into slumber, lulled by a wind not of this earth. Another paper in St. Louis claimed that treasure seekers had dug beneath the ruins and found nothing but a cold so deep they fled in terror. Whether true or not, these stories spread the legend far beyond the Dakota plains. Back home, the families who still remembered grew uneasy at this sudden attention. They did not like the idea of their lost children being spoken of in such ways, turned into a fireside amusement for city folk. But the story had slipped from their hands, and once it entered the mouths of strangers, it grew wings of its own. Travelers came west, hoping to see the ruins. Some took pieces of wood from the site as keepsakes. Others claimed to have heard voices in the wind, though many suspected they were simply repeating what they wanted to believe. What is certain is that the land itself resisted being forgotten. Those who farmed near the site said their cattle would shy from the area, refusing to graze where the schoolhouse had once stood. Horses balked, ears laid flat, as if some scent unsettled them. Hunters who camped nearby said the nights were never quiet there. The wind seemed louder, sharper, filled with tones that almost sounded like children's laughter, or faint hymns sung through the snow dot in 1917. An aging settler named Henry Talbot wrote his memories of that winter in a small diary that was later found among his belongings after his death. He had been a young man at the time of the blizzard, newly married, with no children yet. He described how, after the storm ended, he was one of the first to help dig into the snow-packed door of the schoolhouse. His words were plain but heavy. I saw them as clear as I see my own hands now. Each child in place, the girl at the front with chalk in hand. Not a chair knocked over, not a thing out of order. If you had stepped inside and not known better, you'd think they were only waiting for her to finish the lesson. But they were gone, all of them gone. And I swear to God, the air in that room was not the air outside. It was colder, heavier, and it felt as if it was holding its breath. Talbot never spoke much about it in his later years, but his diary carried the weight of truth. He closed his account with words that many found haunting. The prairie is wide, but it remembers. There are places it does not forgive, and that little school was one of them. In the 1920s, the last standing beams of the schoolhouse finally collapsed, claimed by wind and rot. The ground leveled, the grass grew high, and by sight alone, you would never have known a building once stood there. Yet the place did not pass quietly into the earth. Families told their children to avoid it. Travelers were warned not to camp nearby. The churchyard, where Margaret and her pupils lay buried, became a site of pilgrimage for a few curious souls who came from distant towns to see the graves. Some left flowers, others left notes. A few claimed they saw small footprints in the snow near the headstones, though no children lived nearby. It was around this time that the legend began to shift in tone. To some, it was no longer just a ghost story, but a parable about the prairie itself. The old-timers would say that the land was never meant to be tamed, that men and women had come. with their plows and their schoolhouses and their churches. But the prairie had its own voice, older and stronger. The blizzard of 1877, they said, had been its way of reminding them who truly ruled the plains. The children and their teacher had not merely frozen, they had been taken, drawn into some mystery of the land no man could unravel. And yet, despite the fear, the story also carried a strange kind of reverence. Margaret Hayes was remembered not as a failure, but as a guardian, a young woman who had stood with her students in the face of terror, refusing to abandon them. Mothers told their daughters of her courage, saying she had done what she could in a storm no human could master. Some even said that in her stillness, she had shielded the children from panic, letting them pass into death without fear. Decades rolled by, but the tale never died. Each new generation seemed to add its own layer, its own interpretation. Farmers in the 1940s told of hearing the children's voices carried on the wind while they worked the fields. In the 1950s, a group of teenagers dared each other to spend a night at the site, camping under the stars. By morning, they returned pale and silent, refusing to say what they had heard. Only one spoke years later, saying softly, "It wasn't just voices. It was as if something was trying to teach us, whispering lessons we couldn't understand." By the 1970s, historians began to write about the Dakota Schoolhouse, trying to separate fact from legend. They pored through county records, newspapers, and letters. They confirmed that a blizzard had indeed swept the Dakota Territory in January 1877, one of the worst on record. They found mention of a teacher named Margaret Hayes, though the documents were sparse. Some scholars dismissed the stranger elements as exaggeration, saying the children had simply perished in the storm, and grief had colored the memories of those who found them. But others admitted that certain details could not be so easily explained: the neatness of the desks, the unfinished chalk on the board, the strange carvings on the wall. One historian, after studying every account he could find, ended his work with a question rather than a conclusion. Why, in a moment of mortal peril, did none of them move? The answer has never been found. And so the story lived on, stubborn as the prairie grass, rooted deep in the soil of memory. Families carried it, historians studied it, storytellers embellished it, and always the heart of it remained: a little wooden schoolhouse, a storm that came without warning, and a silence that no one could explain. Even now, when winter comes to the Dakotas and the winds howl across the empty fields, there are those who stop, listening closely. For sometimes, just sometimes, they say the storm does not sound like mere wind at all. It sounds like a room, full of children, reciting lessons in voices that will never fade, bound forever to that long-lost schoolhouse of 1877. By the late 20th century, the physical traces of the old Dakota schoolhouse were long gone. Grass covered the land where its walls once stood, and the prairie winds swept freely across the field. A person driving through would see nothing but sky and earth, wide and endless. But absence did not erase memory. In fact, the emptiness seemed to make the story stronger. Where there was no structure, the imagination supplied one. Where there were no desks, no chalkboard, no stove, the mind rebuilt them, always as they had been on that January day in 1877, frozen in perfect stillness. The legend was not spoken every day, but it had a way of reappearing when the weather turned. A hard winter storm could bring it back in a flash. In small towns scattered across the Dakotas, an older farmer might clear snow from his porch, glance toward the horizon, and quietly recall the schoolhouse tale to whoever was near. Teachers, too, sometimes used the story in their classrooms to frighten children, but as a reminder of the hardships faced by those who came before. The blizzards were not games, they would say. The prairie demanded respect. Yet even stripped of its moral lesson, the story carried weight. Families who had left the region generations earlier still told it around dinner tables far away. Some wrote it down in letters. Others repeated it as part of family lore, a thread connecting them to ancestors who had lived through those years. And with each telling, details blurred, changed, grew sharper in places and softer in others. But always the heart of it remained the same. A teacher, her students, a storm, and a silence no one could explain. By the 1980s and 1990s, amateur historians began to dig deeper. They searched for census records, land deeds, and church registers. They combed through newspaper archives, chasing the trail of Margaret Hayes and her pupils. Some claimed they found mention of a blizzard near the Big Sioux in January of 1877, with accounts of several families perishing. Others turned up burial records listing children who died that year. But the pieces never quite fit together in a way that satisfied everyone. There was just enough fact to anchor the tale, and just enough absence to let mystery grow. It was around this time that ghost hunters and folklorists began to take interest. The Dakota Schoolhouse became a subject for late-night radio programs and small-town newspapers that specialized in the eerie and unexplained. Investigators came to the site with cameras and tape recorders, hoping to capture voices or shadows. They returned with strange photographs, grainy and blurred, which they claimed showed faces in the snow or faint lines of desks etched in the grass. Recordings caught winds that sometimes sounded like whispers, though skeptics said it was only imagination. Still, even the skeptics grew quiet when they stood on that ground in winter. More than one visitor reported a feeling of heaviness, as if the air itself pressed down upon them. Others spoke of sudden warmth, fleeting and unexplainable, as though a stove had just been stoked inside an invisible room. The old carvings on the schoolhouse wall were long gone by then. But in 2003, a farmer plowing the land nearby uncovered a piece of timber buried in the soil. It was weathered, nearly crumbling, but when examined closely, faint scratches could still be seen upon its surface. Spirals, circles, repeating lines, just like the marks described by settlers a century earlier. The timber was passed to a small, local museum, where it sits even now in a glass case. Visitors stop and stare, puzzled by the simplicity of the marks, wondering if they were idle doodles by children or something more. The families connected to the tragedy never fully let go. Even in modern times, descendants of those who lived in the settlement have spoken of it with a strange mixture of sorrow and awe. One woman, a great-granddaughter of Elias Crowley, said in an interview that the story still haunted her family. "We grew up with it like it was part of our blood," she explained. When the snow came down heavy, my grandmother would tell us to hush, because the children might be reciting their lessons again. And we would listen. We would sit still, listening, as if Margaret herself had told us to. It is strange, perhaps, how a story like this lasts. Other blizzards have come and gone, claiming lives in their wake, yet most have faded from memory. Why this one, then? Why this little schoolhouse on the prairie clung to so tightly through the decades? Perhaps it is because of the unanswered questions. Death in a storm can be understood tragic, yes, but clear. Men freeze, families are lost, and the snow buries them until spring. But the stillness of that classroom, the neatness, the peace, it resists explanation. It makes the heart ache in a way the mind cannot soothe. And so the story endures, not only as tragedy, but as mystery. Some say it is a ghost tale, a haunting carried on the wind. Others say it is a parable about the prairie itself, a reminder that nature is larger than any human dream. And some believe it is simply memory, that the children and their teacher were remembered so fiercely, so faithfully, that their presence has never faded, that they remain in the land because people refuse to let them go. Today, when winter storms sweep across the Dakotas, and the winds shriek down the long empty fields, people still tell it. In warm kitchens, as snow rattles against the windows, voices grow softer, steadier, as the tale is passed again. They speak of Margaret Hayes, young and brave. They speak of her students, seated at their desks, hands folded, heads bowed as if in prayer. They speak of the storm, the silence, the strange peace that has never been explained that, and sometimes, in those long nights, when the wind screams louder than it should, listeners pause. They tilt their heads toward the sound, and in that howling, just for a moment, they think they hear something else, a softer sound, gentler, buried deep in the storm. A murmur, a chorus, a rhythm of small voices speaking in unison, reciting. Words long since forgotten. And in that moment, the prairie is not just land, and the storm is not just weather. It is memory alive, the voices of children bound to a schoolhouse that no longer stands, to a teacher whose final lesson was never finished. It is the echo of 1877, carried forever on the Dakota wind, for the prairie remembers.